The passengers on Flight 372 had no idea they were about to witness something unbelievable. The plane was moments away from takeoff when two uniformed officers suddenly stormed the cabin. Their eyes locked onto one man, James Carter, a sharply dressed businessman sitting in first class. Without hesitation, they slapped handcuffs on him, shocking everyone around. Gasps filled the air as whispers spread like wildfire. "Sir, you need to come with us," one officer demanded. James, calm and composed, didn't resist. Instead, he simply stood, adjusting his suit as if this was just another business meeting. The flight attendants looked uneasy, unsure of what was happening. A few passengers pulled out their phones, ready to capture the moment. Then, just as James was about to be escorted off the plane, he turned his head and spoke one sentence. His words sent a wave of silence through the entire cabin. Even the officers hesitated, their grip on him tightening. The energy in the plane shifted instantly. Some passengers looked confused, others concerned. But one thing was clear. Whatever James had just said changed everything. What did he say? And why was he being arrested in the first place? Stay tuned to find out. The cabin remained eerily silent as James stood between the two officers. His posture still confident despite the cold steel around his wrists. A flight attendant nervously stepped forward. "Excuse me, officers, but what's happening? Is he a threat?" Her voice was shaky, mirroring the growing unease among the passengers. One of the officers, a stern-looking man with a rigid stance, tightened his grip on James' arm. "We have orders. That's all you need to know." His tone was firm, allowing no room for questions. But James wasn't panicked. He wasn't even surprised. Instead, he let out a slow breath and scanned the room, his eyes landing on a middle-aged man in the back of the plane. The man who had been staring at James with an unreadable expression quickly looked away. Passengers whispered among themselves. Some speculated about who James was. Was he a criminal? A fugitive? Others exchanged uneasy glances, questioning why the officers refused to explain. James, however, remained silent, almost as if he was waiting for something. Then, as the officers started moving him toward the exit, James turned his head slightly and muttered under his breath, "I hope you know what you're doing." The officers froze. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. James' words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The officer gripping his arm hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with his partner. Something about James' tone, calm yet knowing, seemed to unnerve them. The tension in the cabin thickened, and the passengers, now fully invested in the unfolding drama, leaned in closer. The man in the back, the one James had locked eyes with earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he tapped the screen. Was he calling someone? Sending a message? Whatever it was, he looked nervous, almost as if James' arrest had thrown his plans off track. Meanwhile, a woman seated near the front finally spoke up. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured, shaking her head. "If he did something wrong, why won't they tell us what it is?" A few others nodded in agreement, their unease growing. James remained composed, his eyes scanning the officers' faces, as if studying their every move. "You should double-check those orders," he said quietly. "Because I guarantee, in 5 minutes, you're going to wish you hadn't put those cuffs on me." The officers stiffened. Outside on the jet bridge, another figure appeared, a man in a dark suit, speaking hurriedly into a phone. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than anyone realized. A tense silence settled over the plane as the officers exchanged wary glances. James wasn't resisting, but something about his confidence unsettled them. He wasn't acting like a guilty man. He was acting like someone who knew a secret they didn't. Outside, the man in the dark suit was now pacing, still speaking urgently into his phone. His movements were sharp, his expression tense. He glanced toward the plane's entrance, then at his watch, as if he was running out of time. Inside the cabin, passengers continued whispering among themselves. A few had their phones recording, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't normal. The woman who had questioned the officers earlier leaned toward a nearby flight attendant. Do they even have jurisdiction to do this? Shouldn't an air marshal be handling it? The attendant looked unsure, her hands nervously clasped together. James, still calm, turned slightly to face the officers. "You have about 2 minutes before that phone call comes through," he said, nodding toward the man outside. "When it does, everything changes." His words sent a fresh wave of tension through the plane. Then suddenly, the officer's radio crackled. A voice on the other end sounded rushed, almost frantic. "Do not remove the suspect from the aircraft. Repeat, stand by for further orders." Both officers froze. The man in the suit outside abruptly stopped pacing. The entire cabin held its breath. Something was about to happen. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. The officers stood frozen, gripping James' arms but making no move to take him off the plane. The radio crackled again, but the voice on the other end had already said enough. Something wasn't right. Outside, the man in the suit pressed his phone tighter to his ear, his expression darkening. He turned sharply, speaking faster, his free hand clenched into a fist. Whatever news he had just received, it wasn't what he wanted to hear. Then, as if making a sudden decision, he started toward the aircraft's entrance. James watched everything unfold, his face unreadable. Then, in a quiet but deliberate voice, he spoke just loud enough for the officers to hear. "Now let me ask you something. Who gave you those orders?" The lead officer blinked, caught off guard. "What?" James tilted his head slightly. "I mean, was it really from your department? Or did someone else tell you to come after me?" The officer's grip loosened, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. For the first time, doubt flickered in his expression. The radio had told them to stand by, but James' words made him question everything. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the plane. Passengers gasped, heads snapping toward the sound. A man had dropped his bag. No, not dropped it. Thrown it. His hands were shaking, his face pale. It was the same man James had looked at earlier, the one who had nervously reached for his phone. And now, all eyes were on him. The entire cabin went still. The man who had thrown his bag was breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he backed against his seat. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He looked like a man trapped, caught in a moment he hadn't planned for. The officers turned their attention to him, their grips on James loosening. James exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He took a small step forward, the handcuffs still locked around his wrists. "I was never the one you were supposed to arrest, was I?" His voice was steady, controlled, but someone needed a distraction. Passengers murmured in confusion, their eyes darting between James and the nervous man. The officer's radio crackled again. This time, the voice was urgent. "Detain the suspect in 14B immediately. Do not let him leave." The officer's eyes widened. That wasn't James' seat. Without hesitation, they released their hold on him and turned to the man in 14B. "Sir, hands where we can see them." The man's breathing turned ragged. He glanced toward the exit, calculating his chances, but there was nowhere to run. Slowly, he raised his hands. A 10-second passed before one of the officers moved in and placed him in handcuffs. Passengers gasped, whispering in shock. Some had assumed James was guilty. Others had simply been confused. But now the truth was unfolding before them. As the officers secured the real suspect, James calmly adjusted his suit. Told you you'd regret those cuffs, he muttered, shaking his head. The man in the suit outside rushed up the stairs, but it was too late. The officers had their man. He cursed under his breath before pulling out his phone, dialing frantically. James turned to the officer who had arrested him. "Next time, check your sources." Then, without another word, he walked back to his seat, leaving the entire plane in stunned silence. The plane remained silent as James calmly took his seat again, adjusting his cuffs as if nothing had happened. The officers quickly escorted the real suspect down the aisle, his head lowered, his face drained of color. Passengers exchanged stunned looks, whispering among themselves. Some felt guilty for assuming James was the criminal, while others were still trying to process how everything had unfolded. The lead officer hesitated for a moment before turning back to James. He exhaled, as if searching for the right words. "We were just following orders," he finally said, his voice quieter now. James glanced up at him, his expression unreadable. "That's the problem," he replied. "Not all orders are the right ones." The officer nodded slightly, then turned and walked off the plane with his partner. Outside, the man in the suit was still on the phone, his frustration evident. But whatever he had been trying to orchestrate had clearly failed. As the plane doors finally closed and the flight prepared for takeoff, the woman from earlier leaned over to James. "How did you know?" she asked, still in disbelief. James gave a small, knowing smile. "You learn to recognize when someone's more afraid of getting caught than you are." And with that, the plane lifted into the sky.